and welcome to this edition of The Global View. And today we have with us Jim O'Neill, former chairman at Chatham House, former chief economist at Goldman Sachs, and also the former commercial secretary at the UK Treasury, joining in the show right now. Jim, great to have you on ET Now. Thanks as always for your time. Jim, the new reality for India is the post-tariff regime. A 50% tariff has been slapped in India as of yesterday. Do you think the equity markets were somewhere working with that assumption? And to a large degree, would you say that it's in the price when it comes to India?
Wow. That's quite a belief. I'm still trying to get used to it. Just listening to you summarizing the new reality, or the reality for the moment, is still quite hard to comprehend. Who would have dreamt back in February that this is where things might have settled on tariffs for India? I remember speaking to some Indian diplomats following Modi's visit, and they certainly would not have expected anything like this. So I find it hard, to be honest, to think that the equity market's price has factored this in. Although I very quickly add, I'm not quite sure whether I'd say that for global equities either. Partly because of the remarkable ongoing story with AI and everything to do with it, particularly Nvidia, and obviously we're speaking a few hours or 12 hours after their earnings. The equity markets globally seem to be quite relaxed about the reality that Trump has effectively now imposed a very significant increase in tariff rates with the average of all America's trading partners, India amongst the worst. But I'm not sure that I'd describe myself as feeling as relaxed as the equity markets seem to be, either in India or elsewhere, to be honest.
But Jim, I recall in March you were of the opinion that for the rest of the decade, US is likely to underperform the rest of the world. Not on its own feet, but perhaps because the rest of the world is looking much cheaper. Does that view still hold?
I'm glad you recalled that, because I did say that. And I think because of, to be honest, virtually every day I wake up and read yet more news about Trump-led America, the more I think that this is the decade of outperformance of the rest of the world's markets, both including a quite likely further decline in the dollar, which typically always helps, especially the so-called emerging world, but also in this case elsewhere, because I think he is doing things that both undermining many of the past strengths of the US economy, almost indirectly, almost feels like deliberately weakening the US consumer, and more substantially in some ways, in terms of structural forces, weakening the institutional framework that has been part of why the US has been partly so exceptional. And this is, I think, relevant to India, and I'm looking forward to discussing it perhaps more with you, forcing other countries to think differently about where their alliances are and what can they do domestically and or with other trade partners to reduce their importance of the United States. And you can see that clearly going on in Europe with Germany. And of course, I would have thought there's some more interesting conversations going on between so-called BRIC members than there might have been a few months ago about trying to take some of their own relationships to be more powerful than they have perhaps been in the past.
For instance, even the India-UK FTA signing also clearly is a sign of that, right? But Jim, the fact is that...
Perfect example.
Yeah, absolutely. But all of this is going to take time, right? For us to find newer trading partners and not have all our eggs in one basket, or for that matter, concentration to economies like the US. That transition will take time. And equity markets will be quick to price that in much earlier. Do you think equity markets world over have already begun pricing that in? That concentration pool from the US is going to shift to the rest of the world?
I think to some extent, and linking it to your first quite astute question, I think that has been happening. I remember thinking, even before Trump got to Liberation Day, we'd seen this outperformance of some parts of the world, notably Germany. And I think that was in anticipation of the Germans shifting more on policy that turns out to be right. And as you've said, equity markets are very good at thinking about the long-term change of direction. So I think to some degree that is happening, and that's why other markets are coping reasonably well. If it were just those aspects of tariff policies, and there weren't other related to some degree, but also separately other issues going on, particularly uncertainties about inflation and interest rates, then I would have a lot more confidence that the rally that we have recovered from since the spring in US-led global equities would continue. But I have concerns that the pressure that's being put on the Fed by Trump is going to clash at some point with the underlying previous legislated requirement of the Federal Reserve to try to keep inflation as low to 2% as possible, because the underlying inflation signs aren't that good. And probably the most striking thing in the past few weeks is a similar sort of message in a number of other so-called developed countries too. And so that is lingering as another issue, that it feels that both bond markets and equity markets are, let's just say at the moment, being quite hopeful about where those things might settle. But I see some signs of some concerns there myself. But it may well be that it is just this power of the equity markets to see through all of this and looking for different global rotation, and for the likes of India to prove itself yet again as being a domestically driven economy and market, and that we have more other economies in the world that are will become more domestically driven too. I don't dismiss that as a possibility, and on one level that would be a very healthy thing for the world.
Absolutely. And I think, Jim, that also sort of throws up another question as to how investments across the world are going to be dictated now. Is it going to be with new trends, like what you're seeing play out in the US, with the top 8 large companies all being tech-driven? Is it going to be purely about valuations? Is it going to be dollar-denominated? Or is it going to be a pool of all of the same? Or is it really going to be about which country manages to navigate both geopolitical tenssions and tariffs?
I think it's going to be all of those things put together. And I have to say, as an aside, again, listening to the way you ask these interesting questions, I think for the alpha generators in the equity world and the macro space, I sometimes in recent weeks joked to some of my old pals from my more active days in finance that it's like the heydays of the macro world are being brought back from something that almost haven't been there since before the days of the euro. There's so many issues out there to focus on, and I think it must be true for the sector and stock specific equity players as well. So for those true smart alpha generators, this has got to be a fantastic environment, I would have thought. Also a highly risky one for when you get something wrong, I quickly add. However, but I think all those factors you raised in that question are all going to be constantly playing against each other. I mean, you just look at what we had with NVIDIA earnings last night that sits in the middle of course, the AI story. I mean, quite astonishing revenue growth and seemingly never-ending plans for substantial investments. But I can't help thinking that, you know, we have seen, for those of us of a certain age, we have seen that song played out in history, and at some point, something will not be quite as good as that story seems to currently be. And I have to say that the idea that in another few years, the US stock market is going to be so dominated by just 8 companies, and for that matter, therefore, the world stock market as it is today, is very, very unlikely. And so at some point, some kind of jolt, or whether it be a positive or negative one, will shift us away from that. But obviously, for the very foreseeable future, that remains, if not the dominant theme of global related markets in equities, but certainly very close to it. But I think in parallel, because of what Trump is doing on tariffs, what he's doing with the Fed, and his constant chipping away at the institutional structure of many different parts of the US framework, latest news being is in firing the head of the Center for Disease Control for no obvious reason, it seems to me. You know, there is going to be more and more conservative investment managers looking to shift to other parts of the world. And so those countries that can somehow not irritate this current president any further than they might have done, but more importantly, make sure that their own economy is more dependent on things under their own control, I suspect those are going to be the markets that attract quite a lot of investment, quite rightly so.